Part 2, Imagined Communities of Nation versus Race. In the essay on national culture, Fanon thus distinguishes between national and racial consciousness on the grounds of the authenticity of national culture and in relation to a dynamic, creative, forward-oriented, and struggle-based conception of the nation, compared with an inauthentic, colonially imposed, backward-oriented, stereotyped, and ultimately folkloric conception of race. For Fanon, the transvaluation of negritude remains ultimately trapped in terms of racialized consciousness that is bound to lead up a blind alley. He therefore advocates the embrace of the revolutionary struggle for national liberation against colonial domination instead of organization and cultural activism along racialized lines, even if he also recognizes the potential pitfalls of national consciousness as well. Some 2 decades later, Benedict Anderson would likewise distinguish between national and racial consciousness in his chapter on Patriotism and Racism towards the end of his magisterial and highly influential book, Imagined Communities, first published in 1983. In the book, Anderson theorizes the nation form as a uniquely modern type of imagined community, one imagined as limited and sovereign. He emphasizes the role of a new dominant conception of temporality, homogeneous empty time, in creating the conditions of possibility for the emergence of national consciousness. He further stresses the processes of print capitalism through which the new conception of temporality as synchronicity would be mediated and diffused. Finally, he contends that once the nation form had emerged by the end of the 18th century, it became modular, capable of being transplanted and adopted across a wide variety of political and ideological constellations. Like Fanon, Anderson is concerned to establish the legitimacy of national consciousness, even of nationalism. To do this, he draws a stark contrast between the logic and dynamics of nationalism and those of racism. Anderson contends that in an age when it is so common for progressive cosmopolitan intellectuals, particularly in Europe, to insist on the near pathological character of nationalism, its roots in fear and hatred of the other, and its affinities with racism, it is useful to remind ourselves that nations inspire love, and often profoundly self-sacrificing love. Indeed, he claims, something of the nature of this political love can be deciphered from the ways in which languages describe its object, either in the vocabulary of kinship, motherland, vaterland, patria, or that of home, heimat or tanah air, earth and water, the phrase for the Indonesian native archipelago. Both idioms, he notes, denote something to which one is naturally tied. The nation for Anderson is thus characterized by the emotion of love, not hate, and is based on a community imagined in terms of kinship or home, which in turn generates a willingness to sacrifice. As Anderson notes, the great wars are extraordinary, not so much in the unprecedented scale in which they permitted people to kill, as in the colossal numbers persuaded to lay down their lives. Moreover, he continues, the idea of the ultimate sacrifice comes only with an idea of purity through fatality. Dying for one's country, which usually one does not choose, assumes a moral grandeur which dying for the Labor Party, the American Medical Association, or perhaps even Amnesty International cannot rival, for these are all bodies one can join or leave at easy will. Most often, Anderson adds, the nation is imagined as a community of language. He notes in this regard the primordialness of languages, even those known to be modern. He remarks, no one can give the date for the birth of any language. Each looms up imperceptibly out of a horizonless past. He continues, insofar as Homo sapiens is Homo decens, it can seem difficult to imagine an origin of language newer than the species itself. As such, he insists, languages thus appear rooted beyond almost anything else in contemporary society. At the same time, nothing connects us effectively to the dead more than language. To this end, he contends, if English speakers hear the words earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, created almost 4.5 centuries ago, they get a ghostly intimation of simultaneity across homogeneous empty time. The weight of the words derives only in part from their solemn meaning. It comes also from an, as it were, ancestral Englishness. Anderson proceeds to argue that there's a special kind of contemporaneous community which language alone suggests, above all in the form of poetry and songs. He insists, singing the Marseillaise, waltzing Matilda, and Indonesia Raya provide occasions for unisonality, for the echoed physical realization of the imagined community. He furthermore emphasizes, yet such choruses are joinable in time. If I am a Let, my daughter may be an Australian. The son of an Italian immigrant to New York will find ancestors in the Pilgrim Fathers. If nationalness has about it an aura of fatality, he contends, it is nonetheless a fatality embedded in history. Here, San Martin's edict baptizing Quechua-speaking Indians as Peruvians, a movement that has affinities with religious conversion, is exemplary, for it shows, he insists, that from the start the nation was conceived in language, not in blood, and that one could be invited into the imagined community. Thus today, he concludes, even the most insular nations accept the principle of naturalization, wonderful word, no matter how difficult in practice they make it. As such, Anderson underscores, seen as both a historical fatality and as a community imagined through language, the nation presents itself as simultaneously open and closed, which brings him to the contrast with race and racism. Anderson chastises Tom Nairn, claiming that Nairn is basically mistaken in arguing that racism and anti-Semitism derive from nationalism, and thus that seen in sufficient historical depth, fascism tells us more about nationalism than any other episode. Anderson insists instead, the fact of the matter is that nationalism thinks in terms of historical destinies, while racism dreams of eternal contaminations, transmitted from the origins of time through an endless sequence of loathsome copulations outside history. He adds, Negroes are, thanks to the invisible tar brush, forever Negroes. Jews, the seed of Abraham, forever Jews, no matter what passports they carry or what languages they speak and read. Thus, for the Nazi, the Jewish German was always an imposter. Anderson further contends that the dreams of racism actually have their origin in ideologies of class rather than in those of nation. Above all, in claims to divinity among rulers and to the blue or white blood and breeding among aristocracies. To this end, he notes that on the whole, racism and anti-Semitism manifest themselves not across national boundaries but within them. In other words, they justify not so much foreign wars as domestic repression and domination. He goes on to stress this link between racism and archaic aristocratic ideology by arguing, quote, where racism developed outside Europe in the 19th century, it was always associated with European domination for two converging reasons. First and most important, he contends, was the rise of official nationalism and colonial Russification. Second, he continues, the colonial empire, with its rapidly expanding bureaucratic apparatus and its Russifying policies, pushed bourgeois and petty bourgeois to play aristocrat off center court, i.e. anywhere in the empire except at home. As such, he depicts, in each colony, one found this grimly amusing tableau vivant, the bourgeois gentilhomme, speaking poetry against a black cloth of spacious mansions and gardens filled with mimosa and bougainvillea, and a large supporting cast of houseboys, grooms, gardeners, cooks, amas, maids, washerwomen, and above all, horses. By contrast, Anderson contends, it is remarkable how little that dubious entity known as reverse racism manifested itself in the anti-colonial movements. The dreams of the nation are thus, for Anderson, quite distinct in character from those of race. He concludes, through that language encountered at mother's knee and parted with only at the grave, past are restored, fellowships are imagined, and futures dreamed. Race, time, and the revision of modernity. Homi Bhabha, for his part, in his dense but insightful 1991 article, Race, Time, and the Revision of Modernity, takes Anderson to task for his account of the distinction between the categories of nation and race. Bhabha begins his article by invoking Fanon's earlier 1952 book, Black Skins, White Masks, particularly the chapter, The Fact of Blackness, in which Fanon talks not simply of the historicity of the Black man, as much as about the temporality of modernity within which the figure of the human comes to be. According to Bhabha, Fanon's discourse of the human emerges from that temporal break or caesura affected in the continuist, progressivist myth of man. Bhabha emphasizes the idea of what he refers to as a time lag of cultural difference, which he conceives as a structure for the representation of subaltern and post-colonial agency. Indeed, he motions to an opening up of an interruptive time lag in the progressive myth of modernity, which enables the diasporic and the post-colonial to be represented. In such a vein, Bhabha refers to Fanon's critique of Sartre, contending that Fanon refuses the Hegelian Marxist dialectical schema whereby the Black man is part of a transcendental sublation, a minor term in a dialectic that will emerge into a more equitable universality. Fanon, he believes, suggests another time, another space. Bhabha speaks of the contradictory and unresolved nature of the project of modernity into which this time lag is inserted, in which colonial and post-colonial moments emerge as sign in history. For Bhabha, the discourse of race displays the problem of the ambivalent temporality of modernity. Bhabha champions subaltern and post-slavery narratives for engendering critical theoretical perspectives that effectively interrupt and displace the Western discourses of modernity. He cites the example of Houston Baker's reading of the modernity of the Harlem Renaissance, which strategically elaborates a reformation of mastery, a vernacularism based on the enunciation of the subject as never a simple coming into being, but a release from being possessed. Such narratives, Bhabha claims, prove capable of introducing another locus of inscription and intervention, another hybrid, inappropriate enunciative site through a temporal split or time lag. In other words, he suggests, the temporal caesura, which is also the historically transformative moment, occurs when a lagged space opens up in between the intersubjective reality of signs deprived of subjectivity and the historical development of the subject in the order of social symbols. Pretty dense, to say the least. But what is relatively clear is that Bhabha is seeking to center colonial and slave histories, which he suggests can affect a split consciousness, can introduce a colonial disjunction into modern times, because he contends in such histories, the reinvention of the self and the remaking of the social are strictly out of joint. This leads him to ask, what is this now of modernity? Who defines this present from which we speak? Which in turn leads to an even more challenging question. What is the desire of this repeated demand to modernize? Why does it insist so compulsively on its contemporaneous reality, its spatial dimension, its spectatorial distance? Bhabha goes on to diagnose a tension between the pedagogy of symbols of progress, historicism, modernization, homogeneous empty time, the narcissism of organic culture, the onanistic or fruitless search for the origins of race, and what I shall call the sign of the present, the performativity of discursive practice, the receipts of every day, the repetition of the empirical, the ethics of self-enactment, the iterative signs that mark the non-synchronic passages of time in the archives of the new. For Bhabha, there is something in modernity which is more than modernity, and that something is the signifying cut or the temporal break. With the emergence of modernity as an ideology of beginning, modernity is the new, the template of the non-place becomes the colonial space. But the colonial space, in turn, commingles with, indeed pervades the so-called first world. To this end, Bhabha cites Gyan Prakash, who insists, the third world, far from being confined to its assigned space, has penetrated the inner sanctum of the first world in the process of being third worlded, arousing, inciting, and affiliating with the subordinated others in the first world to connect with minority voices. From here, Bhabha proceeds to pose another question. What is the we that defines the prerogative of my present? His answer would center those at the margins of the first and third worlds. By centering those at the margins, we can effectively introduce the time lag, which is for Bhabha indeed the very structure of difference and splitting within the discourse of modernity, and which thereby turns it into a performative process in which each repetition of the sign of modernity is different, specific to its historical and cultural conditions of enunciation. Bhabha then turns to level of critique against the eminent social theorist Michel Foucault's account of race and racism in the introduction to the history of sexuality, according to which racism emerges in the 19th century in the form of an historical retroversion that Foucault finally disavows. Bhabha chastises Foucault, remarking, what is profoundly revealing is Foucault's complicity with the logic of the contemporaneous within Western modernity. Characterizing the symbolics of blood as being retroverse, Foucault disavows the time lag of race as the sign of cultural difference and its mode of repetition. Bhabha also notes that elsewhere Foucault directly links the flamboyant rationality of social Darwinism to Nazi ideology, ignoring colonial societies which were the proving grounds for social Darwinist administrative discourses all through the 19th and early 20th centuries. Which brings him to Anderson. Bhabha contends, if Foucault normalizes time-lag retroverse sign of race, Benedict Anderson places the modern dreams of racism outside of history altogether. For Foucault, race and blood interfere with sexuality. For Anderson, Bhabha insists, racism has its origins in antique ideologies of class that belong to the aristocratic prehistory of the modern nation. Race represents an archaic ahistorical moment outside the modernity of the imagined community. Nationalism thinks in historical destinies, while racism dreams of eternal contaminations outside history. Bhabha continues, for Anderson, the modern anomaly of racism finds its historical modularity and its phantasmatic scenario in the colonial space, which is a belated and hybrid attempt to weld together dynastic legitimacy and national community, to shore up domestic aristocratic bastions. The racism of colonial empires is then part of an archaic acting out, a dream text of a form of historical retroversion that appeared to confirm on a global modern stage antique conceptions of power and privilege. Bhabha therefore reproaches Anderson. What could have been a way of understanding the limits of Western imperialist ideas of progress within the colonial metropolis, a hybridizing of the Western nation, is quickly disavowed in the language of the opera bouffe as a tableau vivant of the colonial bourgeois gentilhomme speaking poetry against a backcloth of spacious mansions and gardens filled with mimosa and bougainvillea. But for Bhabha, it is in the weld of the colonial site, as contradictorily both dynastic and national, that the modernity of Western national society is confronted by its colonial double. Such a moment of temporal disjunction, which would be crucial for understanding the colonial history of contemporary metropolitan racism in the West, is placed outside history. It is obscured by Anderson's espousal of a simultaneity across homogeneous empty time as the modal narrative of the imagined community. It is this kind of evasion, Bhabha concludes, that makes Partha Chatterjee, the Indian subaltern scholar, suggest from a different perspective that Anderson seals up his theme with a sociological determinism without noticing the twists and turns, the suppressed possibilities, the contradictions still unresolved. Bhabha insists, by relegating the social fantasy of racism to an archaic daydream, Anderson further universalizes his homogeneous empty time of the modern social imaginary. Even so, Bhabha continues, hidden in the disavowing narrative of historical retroversion and its archaism is a notion of the time lag that displaces Foucault's spatial analytic of modernity and Anderson's homogeneous temporality of the modern nation. In order to extract the one from the other, we have to see how they form a double catachrestic boundary, rather like the more general intervention and seizure of the history of modernity that has been attempted by post-colonial critics. Bhabha accuses, at the level of content, the archaism and fantasy of racism is represented as ahistorical outside the progressive myth of modernity. This is an attempt, Bhabha argues, to universalize the spatial fantasy of modern cultural communities as living their history contemporaneously in a homogeneous empty time of the people as one that deprives minorities of that marginal liminal space from which they can intervene in the unifying and totalizing myths of the national culture. Bhabha admits, Anderson goes further in acknowledging that colonial racism introduces an awkward weld, a strange historical suture in the narrative of the nation's modernity. The archaism of colonial racism as a form of cultural signification, rather than simply an ideological content, reactivates nothing less than the primal scene of the modern Western nation. That is, the problematic historical transition between dynastic lineage societies and horizontal, homogeneous secular communities. Nevertheless, Bhabha contends, what Anderson designates as racism's timelessness, its location outside history, is in fact that form of time lag, a mode of repetition and reinscription that performs the ambivalent historical temporality of modern national cultures, the aporetic coexistence within the cultural history of the modern imagined community of both the dynastic, hierarchical, prefigurative medieval traditions, the past, and the secular, homogeneous, synchronous, cross-time of modernity, the present. It is for Bhabha unfortunate that Anderson resists a reading of the modern nation that suggests in an iterative time lag that the hybridity of the colonial space may provide a pertinent problematic within which to write the history of the postmodern national formations of the West. From here, Bhabha reaches the strong conclusions of his approach. To take this perspective would mean that we see racism not simply as a hangover from archaic conceptions of the aristocracy, but as part of the historical traditions of civic and liberal humanism that create ideological matrices of national aspiration, together with their concepts of a people and its imagined community. Such a privilege of ambivalence privileging of ambivalence in the social imaginaries of nationness and its forms of collective affiliation would enable us to understand the coeval, often incommensurable tension between the influence of traditional identifications that coexist with contemporary secular modernizing aspirations. The enunciative present of modernity that Bhabha proposes would provide a cultural political space to articulate and negotiate such culturally hybrid social identities. Questions of cultural difference would not be dismissed with the barely concealed racism as atavistic tribal instincts that afflict Irish Catholics in Belfast or Muslim fundamentalists in Bradford. It is precisely such unresolved transitional moments within the disjunctive present of modernity that are then projected into a time of historical retroversion or an inassimilable place outside history. In sum, for Bhabha, what Foucault and Anderson disavow as retroversion emerges as a retroactivity, a form of cultural reinscription that moves back to the future. Bhabha instead calls it a projective past, a form of the future anterior. He believes that without the post-colonial time lag, the discourse of modernity cannot be written. With the projective past, it can only be written as a narrative of alterity that explores forms of social antagonism and contradiction that are not yet properly represented, political identities in the process of being formed, cultural enunciations in the act of hybridity, in the process of translating and transvaluing cultural differences. Bhabha insists, you might think it lacks time or history, don't be fooled. His is an attempt to constitute a post-colonial critical discourse that contests modernity through the establishment of other temporal sites, other forms of enunciation, a critical discourse that centers the figure of the witness of a post-colonial modernity in possession of another wisdom, coming from those who have seen the nightmare of racism and oppression in the banal daylight of the everyday, a critical discourse that refuses to dismiss racism as archaic or outside of time, but locates it in the very heart of the modern, amidst the ideological matrices of national aspirations. And with that, we'll take a break.